So there's a lot of things to learn from the book of Numbers, and so many times people will skip over books like this in the Bible. So I'm excited today because we're going to talk about conflict resolution. So today's devotion I titled 5 Steps Towards Conflict Resolution. And we're on day 257. We're on September the 14th. And today's morning rinse is Numbers 28 through 32. I know it's 4 chapters. You've got this. Just read Numbers 28 through 32 if you're following along on reading the Bible through in a year. And today's featured verses include Numbers 32, 5 through 6. They said, "If we have found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servants as a possession. Do not take us across the Jordan." But Moses said to the sons of Gad and to the sons of Reuben, "Shall your brothers go to war while you yourselves sit here?" So this scenario sounds like an argument is starting to brew. The children of Israel were at their last leg before crossing into the promised land. I mean, this was it. This was the 11th hour. They are excited. And this is the moment that they have been waiting for. And Moses was ready to send the warriors over the Jordan River to begin the takeover of this promised land. However, a curveball was thrown, causing conflict in the camp that needed to be resolved. I don't know if anybody has ever recognized this part of the story, but there was a curveball. And so there were some simple steps to resolve conflict resolution that are specifically found in this scenario that I want to go over with you. See, you can learn how to do life by just reading the Bible. Okay, so the first simple step in any conflict resolution is to define the source of the conflict. Moses had spent years preparing the children of Israel to take the land that God had promised them. This was their mission. They were on their way to the promised land, and he had been preparing them for a very long time and probably reminding them through the years what their mission was, why they were out there, what was going on. But the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben wanted to live where they were actually currently camping. And so the conflict was they wanted to stay there instead of going across where the mission was. And so they vocalized this conflict in chapter 32, 5. So they defined that root of the conflict. They just wanted to stay where they were at. The next part of conflict resolution is to look beyond the conflict and listen. So it appeared that these men were not interested in helping the rest of the Israelites conquer their piece of the inheritance, which was really unfair. I mean, they were thinking about themselves. They wanted to stay there. They were basically saying, "You guys go. We want to stay here." And it was really unfair for them to, not really want to help the rest of the Israelites obtain the promised land. And Moses reminded them, their fathers from 40 years prior had discouraged the people from entering the land, which appeared to be exactly what these men were doing. They were doing exactly what their father had done. And so if you look at that in chapter 32, 8 through 13. And so they were basically like, we don't want to go in there, just like their dads acted. Despite these concerns and despite the conflict that was risen, Moses did not, didn't shun what they were saying, but instead he listened to them. He listened to where they were coming from, and he looked beyond what they were saying and heard what they were saying. And so in any conflict resolution, you want to know what the conflict is, and you want to look beyond the conflict and listen to what is going on. And this is what Moses did. He listened. And once you listen, you can do what the next step is. Step number 3 is to find solutions based upon that conflict. And sometimes finding solutions is easiest when you clear your head, or you take a break from the situation, or you remove yourself from the conversation and have moments of time where you want to process. And that's a lot of times where you can find the solutions, when you remove yourself and are not in the heat of the moment. We do not know how long the parties conversed with each other, but we do know that the men left to privately problem solve. And so they removed themselves from the conversation. It could have been very heated. I don't know. Even with Moses listening, we know, and I've talked about this in the past, where I believe that Moses had probably an anger issue or an elevation type issue. And so who knows, even though he listened, there could have been moments of heated discussion and conversations about what Moses was trying to do and what they were trying to do. And so it was good for them to actually part their ways. We know that the men left to privately problem solve. And then what they did was they returned to complete the conversation with Moses. And so when we are in a heated discussion, or when there is a conflict, having a moment away from the conversation and having a time to process and having a time to discuss it amongst, whoever it is that you are with, and then come back. Just like what happened here in Moses, they returned to complete the conversation with Moses and probably brought some, solutions with them, and Moses had probably some solutions with him, and then they came together in the meeting of the minds, is what they call it in business. And then, the next step is to come up with acceptable solutions for both parties. So upon the return to Moses, the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben gave their word that they would help conquer the rest of the land in exchange for inheriting the piece of the land that they were asking for. And we can read that part of the discussion in chapter 32, verses 16 through 19. So they came up with an acceptable agreement and looked beyond the conflict. Again, this conflict was they didn't want to go there. They wanted to stay here. And Moses was probably bringing the argument that, wait a second, all these people are trying to, move forward and to be a part of this new promised land, but we need help. And so that's when they came up with the acceptable solution, an agreement between the two parties that, hey, we're going to do this, but can you give us this land? And that's the last step, is the agreement. They provided the solutions. They came up with acceptable solutions for both parties, but then there's an agreement that has to come into place. So the contract negotiation, if you will, if you want to call it that, it included the terms of breaching it. So in this agreement, they not only came up with, that agreeable or that acceptable solution, and the sons agreed to do something and Moses agreed to do something, but in the midst of that, contract negotiation, they included what would happen if neither party agreed and finished what they were going to do. It included the terms of breaching their word and what was agreed upon, and it showed both sides moved to a workable solution. And this was shown in chapter 32, verses 21 through 25. And so looking at this whole entire business transaction, it was a real estate transaction. And, I love the problem solving of this, because in my work as a real estate agent, I do this a lot. We, come up with, whether I'm working with a buyer or a seller, and there's another party that's wanting to enter into that agreement. It doesn't always happen where, I list a property and the property is X amount of dollars, and then a buyer comes and they, ride in on a little cart and the slow motion of, all of it happens and everything is hunky-dory and everything is beautiful, and they don't ask for anything from my sellers, and they just agree, and all of it is happy-go-lucky, and they live happily ever after. That does not happen. Maybe every once in a while it does, but sometimes through the midst of a transaction, whether that's a real estate transaction or a conflict within your family or whatever, there's moments where you have to figure out what the conflict is, what is truly being said, and where the two differences align. And you have to listen to each other and find out what can be happening. I call it a win-win situation. Some people think that a win-win situation is not great, especially in a real estate transaction, because there's somebody that is giving in and they weren't intending to give. And I don't agree with that. I think that when you are in a conflict resolution type of a scenario, or dialogue amongst people, or negotiating certain things, that you both parties have to feel good about it. And if one of the parties doesn't feel good about the situation and doesn't agree with it, then it's not a successful transaction. But in this scenario, they showed how the successful transaction occurred, how this real estate endeavor occurred, and how they obtained the land, and this agreement of both parties that actually occurred. And it's exciting because we can take that in our own personal journey, our own personal lives, and realize that we are always going to be faced with, hurdles, I call them, as we live our lives. And there might be hurdles with our family. There might be hurdles with our jobs. There might be hurdles with, a real estate transaction. There might be hurdles, in the acting world with a set problem. We're always going to be faced in our lives, not every single day and not all the time, but to think that we will never face a hurdle where we have to come to some kind of agreement with someone or a corporation or whatever is probably a little naive in our world. And so coming to, the fact that we can look at biblical examples and see conflict resolution and how conflict resolution was resolved is so cool, because we can apply that to our lives all the time. So today's challenge to dig deeper is to look and see, are you in a conflict right now, or a situation, whether it be relationally or, business wise or whatever? Are you in a situation that needs resolving? If you are in a situation, then take these 5 simple steps. Isn't it cool where, we have the number 5 again, 5 steps that Moses modeled, and strive towards peace in that situation and use Moses's steps. So 1, define the source of the conflict, look beyond the conflict and listen. Then find solutions by potentially leaving the conversation or coming back in a certain time frame. So finding solutions and digging deeper to explore what solutions you may have, and then bring those solutions back. Come with an acceptable solution so that all parties involved can be a part of the conversation. And then lastly, agree. Make an agreement. Put your hand stamp on it, whether you have to sign the agreement or if it's just a verbal agreement, but come to an agreement where you feel like it's a win-win situation involved. But listening is part of the whole entire thing. And as you're pulling out your journal tonight and you're reflecting on, what this potentially could be, and striving towards peace, did you do anything today? Did you make any headway towards a resolution with your conflict? Did you make some progress today in that conflict resolution? And if you did, I want to hear about it. We have a Facebook group. It's called Rinse, Reflect, Repeat. It's not super active, but come on in and, make some notes. There's people who will post once in a while and, just some of their take on scripture and some of the exciting things that they are doing. If you don't have my devotional, which this podcast is all about, my devotional called Rinse, Reflect, Repeat. If you don't have that yet, and today is your first time listening to this podcast, there's a link in the show notes that show you where to go to get a copy of my devotional. I also have a companion journal that goes with it. Every single day I give a challenge, and every single day I give an imploration to reflect on that challenge that you had. And we're all walking through the Bible in a year, and I'm doing it Anita style, which is alphabetically. And it just so happens that we are at the tail end side of Numbers. And then we have one more day in Numbers. And then the next day, we're going to be a full day of reading the book of Obadiah. We'll be in O's. And so how fun it is to see the Bible integrate into each other, and how the books, whether they're in the New Testament or the Old Testament, and jumping back and forth, it's so cool to be able to walk through it this way and to see how they interact. Even though it's not chronological, there's certain things that just keep interacting with each other as we walk through this. So today, I hope that you were inspired and got a little taste of, a real example in the Bible of how conflict resolution happens and how we can do it biblically, and, do that in our world of relationships, in business, and whatever else you are handling in your life. I hope that today inspired you, and until tomorrow, keep rinsing, reflecting, and repeating. God bless you.